Hey class, and welcome to week 3 of administrative law. What you see on the screen is a picture of the Library of Congress's reading room, and that's because this week I'm going to focus solely on types of legal resources and how to find them. This is a long lecture, so I'm breaking it into 3 parts. Here in part 1, I am going to provide tips on legal research, and then we're going to explore secondary sources of law. In part 2, we will cover statutes and regulations, and in part 3, we will cover case law. The real benefit of this lecture is going to be the lecture slides. These slides can operate as a legal research guide for you. They're going to have step-by-step instructions on how to find specific legal resources. Now, the number one most important thing that I can say about legal research, particularly for this class, is do not panic. Don't panic. There's not going to be a test on it. I just want you to become familiar with the basics of legal research, and honestly, the best way to do that is to just jump right in. So as I said, I'm going to break this lecture into 3 parts. Part 1, that's going to explain what happens when a bill becomes a law. That's very important for public administrators to understand. And we're also going to examine secondary legal authorities, which consist of encyclopedias, legislative histories, law journals, and legal treatises. Here is a list of some standard legal terms and abbreviations that you're going to see while performing legal research. You don't need to memorize them, just be aware that they exist. You can always come back and consult this list, or you can, Google it. Here I have highlighted the terms that are going to be most relevant to our class. So for instance, we've got adjudicate, which is to make a final judgment based on evidence and arguments. That's what courts do, but that is also what administrative tribunals do. I've got the CFR, that is the Code of Federal Regulations. That is where our federal agency regulations are published. De novo means anew. So if a court reviews something de novo, they are going back to the beginning. They're starting from scratch. This et sec, that means and the following ones. Literally, it is and sequence. And this is often used to show that a statute spans more than one section. So for instance, Controlled Substances Act, 21 U.S.C., it starts in Section 801, but it goes beyond that. FedReg, or FR, that is the Federal Register. It is the daily journal of the U.S. government. Remanding something, that is an action by an appellate court to send a case back to a lower court for some type of further action. And the USC, that is the United States Code. That is where our federal statutes all live. Every semester, at least a couple of students wonder what the heck this squiggly double S is, and what it is the section symbol. You can find it in Word by going to Insert and then Symbol and making sure your font selection is on normal text. Then you should see the section symbol. If you can't find it or don't feel like it, no problem. Just type out section or SEC period instead. Okay, when we think of the law, what do we think about? For a lot of Americans, it's criminal law that we see on TV shows. Now, fortunately, some of our shows are very accurate. In law school, for instance, we used original Law & Order courtroom scenes to practice our objections. But the law really breaks down into 2 major categories. You've got laws that govern the relationships between private persons, and laws that govern the relationships between the government and private persons or another party. Usually it's a private person, but it can also be government to government. We all engage in what I'm calling private law transactions many times throughout our lives. Every time you buy a car, sign up with a cable company, get a credit card, you are being governed by contracts law. If you sue or get sued because of a car accident, you're governed by tort law. If you create a piece of art, your rights in that work are governed by copyright law. So those transactions, they are with other private actors, the dealership, Capital One, lady whose fender you bumped, or her insurance company, etc. On the other hand, when we interact with a governmental entity, we are engaging in public law transactions. And that is particularly important because we are protected by the U.S. Constitution. So regardless of the type of law, the body of law itself is usually comprised of some combination of constitutions, statutes, regulations, and administrative orders, plus the common law. The common law is the body of law made by judges when they issue their legal opinions. And while we now think of common law as judge-made law, the term common law actually stems from an understanding that unwritten laws can exist. There are these customs and precedents that together create a common law. The idea of precedent, it remains very important in common law. Stare decisis, that's one of the few Latin terms that I'll use. That is the principle that cases should be decided according to consistent principled rules, so that you've got similar facts yielding similar results. So that principle lies at the heart of all common law systems. So how does a bill become a law? Hopefully we have all watched the How the Bill Becomes Law video. If you haven't, go find it on YouTube. But basically what happens is a bill is drafted by a congressperson or a senator, or more often a lobbyist, or recommended by an agency or some type of special interest group. That is introduced, the bill is introduced to the clerk of either the House or the Senate, and it is assigned a number. So it'll be an HR number if it's in the House of Representatives, an S number for the Senate. That bill gets referred to a committee within either the House or Senate. The committee goes through a hearing, it marks up the bill, it gets calendared for debate, then the bill gets read on the floor and debated, and there are amendments proposed. In the Senate, there might be a filibuster. Then it goes to a full vote of each chamber. And then it is sent to a conference committee so that the House and Senate can hammer out differences in their versions of the law. Because remember, a statute's got to be passed by both the House and Senate. Once the conference committee is done, it goes to the president. If the president signs it, boom, now it's a law. So that's the general process. Obviously, there are lots of bills that get introduced that do not make it to become laws. They just stall out somewhere. But this is the normal process for something that becomes a successful law. Now, a question that people don't tend to ask is what happens after a bill becomes a law? And it's useful to understand this. So, once there's been a bill that's passed the House and the Senate, and it's been signed by the president, it is given a public law number. This is simply numbered sequentially by the session of Congress. And that citation format is Pub L, so that's public law, 108-012. 108 in that case would be the session of Congress, so 108th Congress, and 12 is simply, this is the 12th law passed during that session. So that's the start. It gets a public law number. That public law then gets published in pamphlet form, and it's known as a slip law. And this is because you could actually slip them into the back of volumes of laws. Then all of the slip laws from a single session of Congress are combined into session laws, and these are published chronologically in the U.S. statutes at large. And the citation format there is, for instance, 116 Stat 1807. That is where 116 is the volume of the U.S. statutes at large, and 1807 is the page number where that law starts. Finally, the law gets codified into the U.S. Code, and that means that it becomes organized by section. Now, because the U.S. Code is organized by title, and each title covers sort of one broad subject matter area, we often have to break public laws into various pieces and then place them in the appropriate sections throughout the U.S. Code. So when you read a public law, you're reading the entirety of the law passed by Congress. Once it gets codified and placed in the U.S. Code, you're reading individual sections of it. So the citation format, and we'll talk about this more, but the citation format for the U.S. Code is 5 U.S.C. Section 551, where 5 is the title and 551 is the section within that title. Now, why do you need to know this? The main reason that you need to know this is because lawyers, politicians, courts, and the media might use different names to refer to the same law. So, for instance, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act establishes a permit program to regulate discharge of any dredged or filled material into the waters of the U.S., including wetlands. So it's a pretty important permitting process. And I've actually got the text of it here as Section 404A. Now, the EPA, in almost all of its documents, refers to this as Section 404, permit for dredged and filled materials into waters, including wetlands. However, you're not going to find Section 404 in the U.S. Code. That's because Section 404 refers to the section of the public law for the Clean Water Act. But once that was broken up and placed into the code, it sort of gets picked and moved into different places. So Section 404 of the Clean Water Act is actually 33 U.S. Code 1344A. And you can see the text is exactly the same, but you would not necessarily know, looking at 33 U.S.C. Section 1344, that that is Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And this is why I wanted to explain to you the process of what happens after a bill becomes a law, so that you can understand that you might be calling it different things. And if you run into this problem in class, just let me know and I'll actually help you track it. It can be really challenging if you're not used to legal research to be able to sort of figure out where something is in the US Code and how that relates to a public law. So I will help you with that. Just ask me. So here, for instance, is the process for the Clean Water Act after it became law. So what we call the Clean Water Act is really the Federal Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972. It is Public Law 92-500. That means it's the 92nd session of Congress. It was the 500th law. That was actually a fairly active session of Congress. Then it got compiled into the U.S. statutes at large as 86 Stat 816. Then it was put into Title 33 of the U.S. Code. Title 33 is navigation and navigable waters, and the Clean Water Act, obviously, is dealing with those. Title 33 is further broken down by sections, or chapters, I'm sorry. Chapter 26 is water pollution prevention and control. Subchapter 4 is permits and licenses, and voila, Section 1344 is your permits for dredged or fill material. So again, you can see the top one here, that is the public law as compiled into the statute at large, that image. And then you can see at the bottom, that's the same text, but in the US Code. Now, I've got some tips for legal research. The biggest tip I can give you is to become adept at skimming rather than reading. And part of this is, unless you're specifically looking for citations, just ignore them. So for instance, I've got this sentence here, in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1977, public law, blah, 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 statutes, blah, 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 Congress enacted certain requirements. Just skip all of the legal citations when you're reading, because all that they're going to do is kind of make things, it's going to interrupt your flow, it's going to be confusing. So simply skip them. When you skim, you want to skim for headings, bold, and italicized words, as well as other keywords. If you happen to know a specific keyword, like for instance, permit, use Control F to do a keyword search. That works on documents, that works on websites. If you're using a Mac, it's something else, but I'm sure you know what it is. Another tip is if you've got nested menus or a nested table of contents, expand all of them. Expand them so that you can skim through the different titles and sections. And always start, if you don't know where to start with a section that is called General or Definitions. If there's a summary, which in case law will often be called a syllabus, read it. That's going to be really helpful. And also keep in mind that government websites and other legal research resources, they change their layouts all the time. I have to redo these screenshots constantly. And the last time I taught this class, I did the screenshots, and then like literally 1 week into class, a whole bunch of things changed. Hopefully that's not going to happen this time. So hopefully the screenshots that I'm going to have that show you how to perform legal research are going to be useful throughout the semester. Some more tips for legal research. If you don't know anything about your subject or you know very little, start with a legal encyclopedia, and we'll discuss that in just a bit. You can even go to Wikipedia. It actually has really good entries. Just please never ever cite to it. Use it to data mine. Again, if there is a section called General or Definitions, start there. I really can't stress that enough. There's usually good information in the very first section of a statute or regulation. Even when it's called definitions, it might not just be all definitions. You'll also be able to check the notes tabs, which will give you some information, and we will discuss that later. But that generally contains the short title, which is the popular name of a law, and it might contain other information like court cases that have overturned a law or affirmed it, or, it's just the notes have notes about the law. Again, if your material includes expandable sections, expand everything and then browse through them. If your reference material includes breadcrumbs, use them to backtrack to prior sections. Again, we'll cover that in this lecture. Again, skim, pay special attention to bold and italicized words, use Control F or its Mac equivalent to search by keywords. And again, because students always come to me with this, go back to the beginning and start over with the general or the definition section if you feel like you're not getting anywhere. So, to get started with legal research, you want to know what it is that you need to find. If you need to find statutes, you're going to look in the U.S. Code and in state statutes. If you need regulations, you're going to look at the Code of Federal Regulations or the state equivalent. Agency decisions will be in reporters, bulletins, or agency reports. Court decisions are going to be in case law reporters. Legislative history behind a law, you're going to want to look at the Congressional record. To get a good overview of a legal issue, check out a legal encyclopedia or Wikipedia. And then if you want a really in-depth examination of a legal issue, that's when you're going to want to look at a law journal or a law review. Back in the old days, if you needed to locate a law or some type of legal resource, you had to get yourself to a law library. Now it's much easier as there are many different online sources for legal research. That said, some online sources are better than others. So you should be using the online resources that provide accurate, reliable information, and also that you find to be fairly user-friendly, or at least not actively user-unfriendly. So the rest of this lecture is going to take you through a variety of different legal resources, explain how to use them, and how to correctly cite to them. We won't necessarily cover every resource listed on this slide. I'm going to focus on what I consider to be two of the most user-friendly and reliable resources. That would be Westlaw, available through the Auraria Library, and Cornell's Legal Information Institute, available for free from any web browser. We will touch on Nexus Uni, which is our version of LexisNexis, a little bit, but primarily I would say Westlaw over any type of Lexis. We are going to start with secondary sources rather than primary sources. Now, If later in class you know the name of a case or a citation of a statute, by all means jump directly into the primary source. But if you don't know much about a topic, secondary sources are a great place to start. Secondary sources explain, discuss, analyze, and critique primary sources of law. So typically, secondary sources are things like legal encyclopedias, law journal articles, and legislative history. However, you might have an annotated version of statutes or regulations or case law. Those annotations are also secondary sources. The most common secondary sources are actually the annotations from the U.S. Code annotated. Also the Congressional record, where you can find all of the legislative history of federal laws. American Jurisprudence, or AmJur, which is a respected legal encyclopedia. And then various law journal articles and also treatises such as a restatement of contracts. For our purposes in class, AmJur and the Congressional record are going to be the most important forms of secondary sources. There are a variety of methods that you can use to locate secondary sources. Via the Auraria library, you have access to both Westlaw and Nexus Uni. That is the scaled back version of LexisNexis. Both of these provide access to AmJur, and AmJur will provide you with a summary of various legal topics. You can also get to law journals through Nexus Uni and Westlaw. So the slides here are going to right now focus on Westlaw, not Nexus Uni. In my opinion, for legal research, Westlaw is always better. It's easier to use, it's more intuitive, it's less cluttered. You can also find secondary sources online, often via free websites such as Library of Congress or Congress itself, or the GPO, which is the government printing office. So to get started with Westlaw, go to the Auraria Library's homepage and then click the database list. And you can either use the search bar and type in Westlaw, or you can click W and scroll down. So unlike Nexus Uni, which defaults you to an absurdly large search bar and assumes you want to search for news, you can see that on the bottom, Westlaw, that's the image on top, sends you to a fairly uncluttered landing page that really clearly shows you categories of legal materials. From the Westlaw landing page, you can either use the search bar or you can browse through content. So you'll see Westlaw defaults to the All Content tab. That's got links to cases, statutes, regulations, administrative decisions, secondary sources, and more. If you were to click the Federal Materials tab, you'll see that you can select from federal cases, either all together or organized by circuit. It also includes links to the U.S. Code annotated, the Code of Federal Regulations, and the Federal Register. Now, I personally like to access the Federal Register through its own website, and we will cover that later. Westlaw also has a State Materials tab. If you click that and click a state, you will get everything broken down by the type of legal resource. So here you can see that I selected Colorado, and now Westlaw is offering links to Colorado case law, state and federal, as well as Colorado's statutes, regulations, and other materials. The Practice Area tab has a bunch of different categories of law. You can click one. I just selected environmental law, and Westlaw will give you a rundown of potentially valuable legal resources, relevant cases, statutes, regulations, etc. Just keep in mind that not everything is relevant in every situation, and keep in mind that Westlaw organizes a lot of these practice areas by the most recent documents, particularly when it comes to case law. So while this practice area tab can certainly be useful, don't get lost in all of the information there. It's not really going to be the best starting point for you. American Jurisprudence, or AmJur, on the other hand, is a fantastic starting point. It's a great secondary source for our class. So Westlaw has a link to secondary sources directly from its main page, which you can see at the top. If you click that, and then you click American Jurisprudence 2D. In legalese, 2D means second edition. I don't know why we kicked out the N. So AmJur, it's an encyclopedia, so it's organized alphabetically. You can use the AmJur search box, or you can just browse by contents. So I want to browse by contents. So let's take a look at abduction and kidnapping. This topic has absolutely nothing to do with our administrative law class. I'm just using it so that you can see a section of AmJur and get used to how you use it. So here's what comes up after you click on the abduction and kidnapping entry. Remember, if you're not quite sure what you need, expand all of the sections so that you can browse. Also remember to read a summary if one exists, because the summary might actually give you as much information as you need. So for instance, if you click the abduction and kidnapping summary, you'll be taken to this short summary of the crimes of abduction and kidnapping. So here you can see AmJur's legal citation in case you need it. Unfortunately, AmJur citations always include the name of the topic, so they're pretty long. However, it's an encyclopedia, so you probably don't want to cite to it anyway. You can use it to learn about a topic and then use its links to case law and statutes to data mine, much like you would with Wikipedia. Again, I do recommend expanding the table of contents on the left side of the screen. So once I clicked and expanded the table of contents, this was the result. Here we're looking at section 1, the general nature and historical development of the offenses of abduction and kidnapping, as well as some definitions. Again, if you're to cite to this section, you've got to include the section number. I have highlighted the full citation on the screen. Westlaw and also Nexus Uni provides some header information before it gets to the actual section. So you can see that header information in gray boxes. West's key number digest, which it's showing you in part, that's very useful for attorneys and others who need to engage in some really hardcore legal research. For our purposes, you can safely ignore these headers, proceed directly to the text. Now here is where AmJur can be really helpful. You can quickly find answers to certain questions. Let's say you've been asked the following question. To be guilty of kidnapping, must the defendant use force to confine the victim? So back in ye olde days when I went to law school, there was no Google, and for our first year, we were not allowed to use Westlaw or Nexus. So to find this answer, we would have to go into the library stacks, use the print version of AmJur, or slog through volumes of case law and statutes looking for the answer manually. Fortunately, you don't have to do that because the library has come to you. So first, understand what you're being asked. Must kidnapping include the element of force? And must the victim be confined? So you're looking for elements of the crime of kidnapping. Go back to that table of contents. You're going to see a category called Basic Elements. Click that. Then you will see section 24 is about force or threat and confining or taking by force. So that looks like it might answer your question, looks promising at least. So click that. Now from here, I recommend doing a keyword search. Search for useful words or parts of words. So for instance, to answer this question, you know that you want to find out about confining a victim. But rather than searching for the full word confining, which will not bring up variations like confine or confined, search for just the first few letters of the word. And here you'll see that in some jurisdictions, the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant confined the victim by force. So there you go. You have found at least part of your answer in the very first line of this entry. You can also click the note button, that little green N1, to get the footnotes. So now the second sentence, which starts out, furthermore, there is authority. That is referring to legal authority, which means statutes, regulations, or case law, to support the statement that yes, the crime of kidnapping does require the element of taking by force. If you read a bit further, you will learn that force is not limited to physical force, like shoving a victim or pulling a gun on him. Fraud, threats, intimidation, anything that instills fear is considered a form of force in the crime of kidnapping. So there you go. Now you know the answer to the question, to be guilty of kidnapping, must the defendant use force to confine the victim? And the answer for at least many jurisdictions is yes. The defendant must use force, but that force does not have to be purely physical. All right, so here is our first legal research exercise. There are going to be several of these throughout this week's lecture. I strongly recommend that you pause the lecture and work through the exercises, as you get to them. If not, at least have the lecture slides on hand when you work through them. You are going to have to post your answers to the D2 discussion board. You can use that discussion board to ask questions and to help your classmates learn how to find these answers. The board is going to be set up so that you have to make some type of initial post before you can see your classmates' posts. Now, again, these exercises are not necessarily specific to any topics that we are going to cover in class. I want to start you off with some fairly easy topics so that you can practice the process of legal research, because the process is the same regardless of the complexity of a law. And later in class, you are going to have to know this process for our written assignments and for the final policy memo. All right, so take some time and work through this legal encyclopedia exercise. Now, moving on from legal encyclopedias, let's talk about legislative history. The Congressional record is a secondary source, like AmJur, but it provides specific insight into Congress's intent when it passed a law. States will have their own version of the Congressional record. You can search the Congressional record, or you can use a public law number to find information specific to that public law. You can see I've got those highlighted on the screen. All right, let's check out the 107th Congress, 107, which was in session when I graduated from law school. The Congressional record lets you browse by date within each session of Congress. So this means that you will need to use the drop-down menu to find the correct session. Fortunately, the people who run this website have taken pity on us, and they have included the dates for each session of Congress, so you don't need to go find some chart that matches up the calendar to the session. Here is a list of every issue of the Congressional record during the 107th Congress. That Congress met from January 3rd, 2001 to January 3rd, 2003. It spanned the final weeks of the Clinton administration and then the first 2 years of the George W. Bush administration. The 107th Congress went through 3 different changes in majority party. It went through the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the anthrax attacks, and the DC sniper shooting spree, which wound up killing 10 people, including an FBI agent. Really, all of this had the nation's capital region on edge. Now, I graduated from law school in early or mid-May prior to all of the various crises of 2001. It was so long ago and so much happened in the immediate aftermath that I don't actually remember my exact date of graduation, so let's take a look at May 15th. So you can see I've got May 15th there highlighted at the bottom. You can jump directly to portions of the Congressional record, such as the Daily Digest or the start of Senate or House proceedings for that day, or you can review the whole issue in PDF format by clicking the link for entire issue. So here we have the May 15th, 2001 issue of the Congressional record. It is volume 147, number 66. The whole issue is 127 pages long. It starts with the House, and then it moves on to the Senate. If a chamber of Congress did not meet that day, the Congressional record will say so. For example, the smaller inset at the bottom is the January 27th, 2011 issue. and it notes that the House was not in session that day. If you have to access an issue of the Congressional Record that was published prior to the 101st Congress, which was late 1989, early 1990, then I am very sorry for you because you are going to have to go use microfilm or microfiche machine at the library. Although first you can Google it to see if some website happens to have a copy. Do keep in mind that some legal resources are not available in regular university libraries. You can only find some of this stuff in law libraries, which are located in law schools and at major law firms. They do tend to be restricted to students, faculty, staff, and alums, but more and more of them are opening their doors to the public. So CU Boulder's Law Library, for instance, is open to the public, so you can make use of that if you need to. It might also be worth your time to go speak to a law librarian, because these are professionals, they're amazing sources of knowledge, and they can direct you to the appropriate resources. I want to talk a little bit about public law information. Now, public law is a primary source of law. It is the form of the statute actually passed by Congress, but I'm including it here because using the public law number in Congress.gov can get you a lot of information, including legislative history. So if you know your law's public law number, you can use Congress.gov, you can find a bunch of information. So for example, going back to the 107th Congress, it debated House Resolution 5472, that's HR 5472, which eventually passed into law as the Protection of Family Farmers Act of 2002. Now you can click the PDF to get a PDF version of the entire public law, or you can click on the bill numbers to learn more about how the bill was introduced, who co-sponsored it, and additional legislative history. For example, here is the specific bill information for that Protection of Family Farmers Act. You can see it was sponsored by James Sensenbrenner, a Republican from Wisconsin. It went through the House Judiciary Committee, and the very last action for this particular bill is that it became law. It was assigned a public law number, public law number 107-377. That means it was the 377th law passed by the 107th Congress. So be sure to click through all the various tabs to learn more about this bill that became a law. Right now we are just on the Summary tab. If you want to know when a bill was referred to a committee, or whether it passed with or without amendments, or the date the president signed it, click the Actions tab. All right, so here you go. Here's the Actions tab. You will see a reverse chronological list of all of the actions taken on the public law. You can also find information about bills that did not become laws. They died somewhere in the process, in which case that little flow chart at the top would stop somewhere before it reaches became a law. So all of these actions on a bill before it became the law are part of your legislative history. So this is official information, but it is still a secondary source of law because it is not the statute itself. Moving on to law reviews and journals. These are excellent secondary sources if you want to take a deep dive into a specific legal issue. That could include a specific case, statute, or regulation. Law reviews and law journals are essentially the same thing. Usually the term law review refers to a law school's primary journal, which has a very broad focus, whereas the rest of the journals are more topical. That is not always the case, though. At GW Law, where I went to school, there are actually 3 law reviews: the GW Law Review, the GW International Law Review, and the Business and Finance Law Review. GW Law also hosts the Public Contract Law Journal. That is the premier journal for attorneys in the field of government procurement. It's published along with the American Bar Association. GW also has a Journal of Energy and Environmental Law. It's got an Intellectual Property Journal and a Federal Circuit Bar Journal. Regardless of what you call them, law reviews and law journals are scholarly publications. They are usually edited by law students in conjunction with law school faculty members and produced in collaboration with a National Bar Association or a section of the American Bar Association. They will contain lengthy articles and shorter essays by professors and lawyers, as well as comments, notes, developments in the law that might be written by students, possibly speeches from symposia, things like that. Law journal articles often focus on new or emerging areas of law, and they will offer you a more critical commentary, a more scholarly commentary than a legal encyclopedia. So some law journals are going to be dedicated to a particular topic. You can probably find a law journal geared towards almost any topic of law, including gender and the law, animal rights law, water law, or environmental law. Google Scholar is a great place to quickly locate law review articles. I actually think it's even better than Westlaw because you can use your standard Google search. Now, make sure that you're not on the main Google homepage. You actually want to be on Google Scholar, which is scholar.google.com. And if you're looking for articles, be sure that you do have that articles button selected. You'll see that you can also use Google Scholar to search for case law. Now, as long as you are logged into the CU Denver network, Google Scholar will automatically link to available databases or even provide a direct link to the PDF version of the article that you're looking for. You can see here I have searched for the term Chevron deference. You will become very familiar with that term. And Google found specific law review articles available through JSTOR and other databases. And because I was logged into the CU network, I just clicked that PDF link and the article popped right up. Okay, now that you've got a basic grasp of secondary sources, please watch part 2 of this lecture, which covers statutes and regulations. And then part 3 is going to cover case law and a couple words on administrative decisions.